Morning, everybody. I'm going to pause for just a minute or two and let people get online. Okay. Greetings, friends, C3 people. It's good to see some of you joining online. Um, what a strange world we, we live in. I wanted to begin maybe just with a few housekeeping things. For the foreseeable future, we will be doing this, something like this, every single Sunday morning at 10 a.m. until this madness is over. So check in on Sundays. Join us live. Add your comments. In fact, at the end, I'll experiment a little bit and maybe even take a few questions from you, which I think would be interesting. So more housekeeping details. So I'm going to speak for a while, maybe like a half an hour or so. And then if you're a regular to C3, like you come on Sundays, you know that we have a guest musician every single week. And she's going to be joining us at the end, not here. She's going to do her own Facebook Live thing, and I'll try to repost it. That's this week. It's Patty Pershela. So I don't know. It just seems like a creative way to respond to these weird times we're in right now. So I'm going to teach. We'll also have music at the end. We'll see how that works. It might take us a week or so to work out the kinks. A few more things on housekeeping. So every Sunday, 10 a.m., we're going to do this. On Mondays, we're going to post a kids talk that's going to be pre-recorded. So feel free to watch that on Mondays. I think we're going to do that 3 if we can sort it out this week. And then, of course, reshare it as you like. And every Wednesday, we're going to do our meditation. So again, as part of our regular service, we have I talk, we have a meditation, we have music. So we're going to do the meditation, but we want to put it on Wednesdays. Wednesdays at noon, we'll post our weekly meditation from somebody in the community. Really, really important to hear from, not just from me, but from the amazingly talented and interesting people at C3 through our weekly meditations. So look for that. And most importantly, I think in terms of housekeeping, please share this video as you're watching it. Or if you're watching this later, feel free to share this video. I think a lot of churches, organizations, spiritual-ish places are doing things like this, which I think is really needed and healthy and important. And yeah, someone was asking on Instagram, 10 a.m., what time 10 a.m.? This is Eastern Standard Time is when I'm going to start every week. So I think that's enough housekeeping. Other than just a brief word on donations, if you're a regular part of C3, you know that 80% of our donations come through weekly giving, and we still need that money to make this happen, to invite guest musicians, to pay our bills, all that kind of stuff. I'm sure you already know that, but I just wanted to mention that. And the way to do that is to go to our website, c3westmichigan.org, and donate, or if I can figure it out, I'll put a link down in the comments for a way to stay connected. So yeah, I hope you're staying safe and smart and courageous and compassionate. This is not an easy time. So I want to get right into the teaching. We usually begin with a reading, and I'm going to do a reading today from Joanna Macy from this book, Active Hope. It's a co-authored by Chris Johnstone. The subtitle is "How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy." It's primarily a book about climate change and the kind of clash between the industrial culture and the biosphere. And so she's imagining, and after being an activist for like 50, 60 years, this book is, I think, about imagining a more hopeful way of making change in the world. And it's relevant because I think if it's not obvious to you, the two major crises right now are global climate change and its clash with the modern world, and this global pandemic. And in some ways they're intertwined. So I think she has some interesting things to offer. I forgot to say, the title of the series that I'm sort of working with at this point, I'm going to call it What Really Matters. And today's subtitle is Hope, or at least just a few thoughts on hope. I think the title, What Really Matters, is kind of personal because I don't know if you're feeling what I'm feeling, but it's I think because of the massive disruption I'm sort of going through, almost like a searching moral inventory in 12-step language here. You know, how the hell have I been living? You know, what is going on here? And what really matters? What matters? And that's not like that's not an hour's worth of thought. That's sort of just this ongoing and unfolding invitation. And it seems like the invitation to examine questions like what really matters only ramps up the more sort of data and information and fear and panic and numbers start coming at me and coming at us. So I want to at least try to, in my own small way, every week at 10 o'clock, say, at least ask the question, what really matters? Maybe that's what we're doing individually, and in this way, collectively. What really matters collectively? And I think it's time for some re-examination. And maybe another point along those lines comes from Carl Jung. Carl Jung says that growth comes through collision, which is, I suppose it's not great news, but on the other hand, it's great news that whenever something about our worldview, our way of life, to use fancy language, our egoic consciousness collides with something, collides with suffering, loss, great love, just a collision of how we thought the world is or was to be, it collides with something that is an opportunity for growth. And I can't say it enough. We need to grow up. And I mean, I guess I need to grow up, and we need to grow up as a culture, and we need to grow up as a globe. I mean, we've been saying for a long time that the world is deeply interwoven and connected, and everything is in this massive web. This is a global community, and yet it doesn't feel like that most of the time, except when there's a collision. And that's what's happening now. Suddenly things like borders, a virus pays no attention to. And we realize how deeply, deeply intertwined we are and interrelated and interconnected. And we need masks from China and tests from Europe. And it just unfolds from there. And it's humbling to see. It's sort of, in some ways, I think, peels back the mask of the go it alone American illusion. And that's not to say I think that has its own gifts too. But I am my own man, I am my own woman. I can go and settle where I want to settle, which is much of the energy and even mythic energy that is part of the West and part of American culture is just seen for the illusion that it is, that on the one hand, yes, it can take some noble and courageous effort to take risks, but we take those risks in a deeply interwoven and interconnected community and web. So this is a massive collision, and I want to say that means it's an opportunity for growth. And at least as I'm looking at that right now, the first question is to ask something like, what really matters? What really, 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 really matters right now? And we can start on the personal level and the family level and the level of ordinary everyday activities like commerce and food and health and well-being and free time and work and money and the survival dance and what really matters. So that's kind of some of the stuff that's been floating around in my head. And I thought of a story this morning. I'm still going to get to my reading. I said we're going to start with the reading. I guess we'll go to a reading later. I thought of a story this week. I was thinking about, I can't help it because my own consciousness, my own worldview, my own upbringing is deeply rooted in the traditional stories of the Bible. And it's funny how often they bubble up just in my awareness, or I'll hear something on the news and I'll remember a Bible verse, and which is just strange. I think it's in my personal psyche, but as I've said before to the C3 people, it's also in the collective field. It's in the collective psyche, if you will. The collective consciousness might be a better way of saying it. And I was thinking about the fantastic story of Jacob. So Jacob steals the birthright from his brother and tricks his own father and gains the inheritance as the younger son of twins, Jacob and Esau, which, by the way, side note, is just an image of the human psyche, where we have a wild side, that's Esau, and we have a good boy or a good girl side, and that's Jacob, and they're often at war. So the one that wants to stay at home, and the more domesticated self, and the wild indigenous sort of person of the land, that's the Jacob and Esau dynamic. So anyway, they're kind of at war, as brothers are often at war, and Jacob steals the birthright and has to flee. He ends up having to run for his life, and which is really kickstarts his own development, meaning you don't grow up unless you leave home. So here Jacob is off, and it's late, and he lies down at night, and he says, the text says he puts his head on a stone, and he uses a stone for a pillow, which is interesting just in and of itself as a symbol. Stones in the ancient world were often stood up as sort of sacred stones, so there's a little bit of that dimension there too, but it's like the earth and a kind of an image of groundedness and presence and earthiness and settledness, and here he is sleeping on a stone, but he's on the run really from his own brother, and he has a dream, a very famous dream. And in the dream, he sees angels, and that word really means messengers in Hebrew. It's not like flying beings, winged beings that we sort of get from the Middle Ages. But anyway, he sees an image, and in this image, this vision, angels are, I think, ascending and descending, moving up and down between the heavens, which is sort of an image of the divine, and the earth, that the earth and the divine are connected, and they're in conversation and in communion and in a kind of dynamic relationship, a passing between the divine forces of the universe and the earthiness of everyday existence. And there, all of a sudden, Jacob realizes that the world is much more connected than he thought. And he wakes up and he says these famous lines. He says, God, probably Yahweh, or I'd have to look it up, Yahweh or Elohim, God was in this place and I didn't know it. And on the one hand, a surface reading would be something like, oh, I didn't realize that the divine, so to speak, is not off somewhere else, but is here, present in relationship with the earth and with with the everyday, and actually with this physical place, which he then renames the house of God, Jacob does, or Bet El, the house of God. So that's one reading, and that's kind of the common reading. But I actually think there's something else going on here that I'm seeing as kind of a symbol or a metaphor for the age that we're in. Jacob is going about his life, and in this case, running from his brother, trying to gain something, a sense of security and inheritance and materials and so forth. And he goes to sleep, and suddenly he sees that the world is not the way he thought it was or is. That's the threshold of transformation that he passes through. I thought the world was one way, and suddenly I went to sleep and I woke up and the world was different than the way I imagined it. And his language of that was God was in this place and I didn't know it. And to me, I see this image of going to sleep and waking up exactly as a symbol for the age that we're in. It's like the modern world. It's like we've been asleep at the wheel. And we've known things like our healthcare system and our food system and our medicines and the environmental impact of our industrial global society. We know, everybody knows, conservative and liberal, that this has impacts on the health and well-being of us and the planet. And we also, I think, have known intellectually on one level that it's pretty thin, but I don't think we realize just how thin. And a single virus can disrupt the entire global community, something invisible. And that's like waking up from a dream. That's like going to sleep thinking the world was one way and waking up and realizing the world is completely different. Jacob's language, God was in this place and I didn't know it. In other words, the world is much more interconnected and interwoven than I ever really thought possible. And so I see this as kind of a transformational threshold kind of passage or initiation, and it's like the blinders come off. And that is what is happening, in my opinion. The blinders are coming off, and they're being forced to come off to see really what's going on. And how have we been living, and how impermanent is human life? From dust you came, to dust you shall return. And the kinds of guarantees that we all have just taken for granted suddenly seem up in the air. And that's a collision, to use the language I used before, that's collision. And that's like the blinders coming off, like Jacob waking up from a dream and saying, I didn't realize the world was this way. And the question is, how will we live going forward? So that's in the background. So a few thoughts on hope here, because I think I've heard a few people speaking publicly about remaining hopeful, and I think that's really important and needed. And I also want to ask, what do we mean by that? And I think Joanna Macy starts pointing in a direction that I think is both challenging and beautiful at the same time. So this is from her poem. I guess it's kind of a poem. Again, Act of Hope is the book I'm reading from. Trusting the Spiral. She says, active hope is not wishful thinking, which right away I think is a challenge. Like, I have to be honest that I've engaged in some wishful thinking too. I mean, just simple things like, hey, maybe next week this will just all be gone and it'll all be a bad dream. It'll mutate and change, which, by the way, viruses do mutate and sometimes change. But she says active hope is not wishful thinking. Active hope is not waiting to be rescued by the Lone Ranger or by some savior. Active hope is waking up. That's what made me think of the Jacob story, perhaps. Active hope is waking up to the beauty of life, on whose behalf we can act. We belong to this world, she says. We belong to this world. The web of life is calling us forth at this time. And I think the real prophets of our age, or sages of our age, are saying things like, yes, this time is difficult, and this time is calling forth from us our own deeper resources to be engaged. She goes on, we've come a long way and are here to play our part. With active hope, we realize that there are adventures in store, strengths to discover, and comrades to link arms with. Active hope is a readiness to engage. And I think of all the lines, this is the one that strikes me with the most power. Active hope is a readiness to engage. In ourselves and in others. A readiness to discover the reasons for hope and the occasions for love. A readiness to discover the size and strength of our hearts, our quickness of mind, our steadiness of purpose, our own authority, our love for life, the liveliness of our curiosity, the unsuspected deep well of patience and diligence, the keenness of our senses, our capacity to lead. None of these things can be discovered in an armchair or without risk. I hear Joanna Macy calling out from us the deeper resources: quickness of mind, love, purpose, authority, love for life, curiosity, patience, diligence, our capacity to lead. And to bring these out is actually to enhance the risk of living. It's sort of like saying, in the darkest of times, calls from us the deeper well of resources that we have. And I'm mentioning that because last week, if you listen to last week's talk, I tried to, in some senses, normalize and say out loud that it's okay to feel the instincts kicking in of fight, flight, freeze. None of us are above this. None of us are above this. We all have these instincts. In fact, the ego, to use psychological language, the I, the ego, isn't even in control of the instincts. They well up from the deeper resources. And the survival mechanisms we have as human beings are one reason why we're here on this planet still. And the 200,000 year experiment of human evolution, in our most contemporary form here, in large part, or in some part, is due to these survival instincts. Fight, flight, freeze, they've kept us alive, but that's not the only thing. In fact, compassion, cooperation, community, love, grace, and here's her list: quickness of mind, steadiness of purpose, love for life, curiosity, imagination, I'm adding that. The deep well of patience and diligence is also part of what it means to be a human being, and those get activated. So it's like we're feeling two things at the same time: our survival mechanisms and our deeper resources. And I think active hope is saying yes to those deeper resources. It's saying, I don't just want to be full of sort of wishful thoughts here, but what of my own patience, endurance, purposefulness or purpose, curiosity, compassion, love, community, cooperation? What's being called forth here? And how can I say yes to that? That to me is hopeful. That is accessing or living out a hopeful way of being in the world. And I actually have a couple of questions that I think that I've been asking that you might find are helpful too. Along the lines of accessing our own sort of deeper roots here. I think this would be a curious exercise. What if you wrote down or journaled a bit, what have you survived? What have you survived? Like really? Traumas, hardships, wounds, job loss, heartbreaks, betrayals, the death of a loved one, poverty in its various degrees. What have you already survived, really? Just to remind yourself, okay, yeah, I have resources. What have I survived? Here's another one. another question that I think is related to the dual side here, survival, and the other side maybe is thriving. Here's the other question: when have I really thrived? Not only what have I survived already, but time periods in my life where I've not just survived but thrived, lived into the fullness of who I am, and access some of those deeper resources. Or maybe another way of saying it is being surprised by our own deeper resources. Maybe that's actually more, if I'm honest, I guess it feels less like accessing, like I'm going to go in and snatch these deeper resources, but almost softening into them and finding at surprising moments a sort of a welling up of courage or of resourcefulness or creativity or ingenuity to face life's challenges. So I think these two questions, just looking at your own history, maybe your family history, what have we survived? I mean, I was thinking about my own grandparents. Like, my grandfather came over here from Ireland. My whole family's from Northern Ireland on my dad's side, and my mom's side is actually from Ireland too. So a lot of Irish blood. My great grandfather came over here to survive the potato famine and moved to Detroit. Only tragically, then my great grandmother died of cancer, and one of their own children was hit by a train, of all things, in Detroit. And it was so difficult that my great grandfather moved the whole family, what was left of the family, back to Ireland. And my grandpa was born in Detroit, but at age 3 immigrated back to Ireland, back to a land where they couldn't make it in the first place. And then only sort of the next generation later, when my grandpa got married and started having kids, he moved his family from Belfast back to the United States. So this back and forth, like, it's just amazing that I'm even here, really, that any of us are here. I mean, my mom still has the single trunk that my grandpa brought over from Belfast. Like, imagine putting everything that you think you might need that's precious to you and moving to another country by boat into a trunk. That's all you get. So I don't know, that image just popped into my head as I'm talking right now. What have I survived and when have I thrived are the two kinds of questions that I think can help remind us that we have this capacity for active hope. Yeah, so let me read another passage here. So I want to read a speech by Václav Havel. He's a playwright, and he was the former president of Czechoslovakia. And this is a very famous speech that he gave, and I'm reading from Nature and the Human Soul, Bill Plotkin, one of my teachers and mentors. He has this little, he has the speech in a section of this book, and I thought I'd read it to you because it's about hope. So Václav says that hope is a state of mind. That's the first thing that he says. It's a state of mind, which I think right away is kind of a challenge. Well, what do you think? That's different than wishful thinking. It's a mode of being. Maybe you could even say it's a kind of worldview would be another way of putting it. So he says, hope as a state of mind, not as a state of the world. So in other words, looking out at the world, and obviously right now, a world of difficulty and some chaos and some disorder. And he says, hope comes from the state of mind, not from just looking at the state of the world. He says, either we have hope within us or we don't. It is a dimension of the soul. And it's not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. To me, I think this is profound, because I think ordinarily we think, hey, I'll be hopeful if I can sort of do the math on the situation. This plus this equals reason to be hopeful. Or this plus this means it's going to get better, therefore I will be hopeful. He actually is saying something much more challenging, that it's not dependent on an observation of the world. So he goes on, hope in this deep and powerful sense is not the same as joy that things are going well, or a willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. That's what he means by hope. It's this inner soulful resource or way of being or state of mind, you could say, that is willing to work for something because it's good. It's like looking at the world and saying, it's bad. I'm just now thinking of some of the healthcare workers. I don't know if I've been pretty much glued to the internet. Although my phone, my phone, I was like, where's my phone? Told me that my screen time was down 12%, which is total BS. It cannot be true. Or if it's down 12%, I've been supplementing it with the 7 other screens I have access to. So I've been glued to the news. And it's just been probably like you all, just coming at us nonstop. What was my point with that? And maybe what I was going to say is that I've been trying to assess the situation, like doing the math or looking at the numbers and as reason for hope. But he's saying, no, hope is acting in spite of that situation. I know what it was. I've been thinking about the healthcare workers. They are not saying, I don't know if you saw any of those images from Italy, and they're not saying, hey, we see light at the end of the tunnel, therefore we're acting. They're saying we're acting even though we do not see light at the end of the tunnel. In fact, we're running out of resources and people are dying, and we're having to make some of the toughest decisions that we've ever had to make as professionals, and we're putting one foot in front of the other, and we're putting our own lives at risk. I mean, to me, that is active hope. That's the kind of hope that Vaclav is talking about in this speech. That's moving in spite of the world, working for what's good, even though the math tells us it's not going to work out. He says that comes from the deep resources of the soul. So I want to keep reading here. The more unpreposterous the situation in which we demonstrate hope, the deeper that hope is. Or I guess my way of saying it, the more ridiculous the situation is, and the worse the math is, when you act with that kind of way of being or state of mind in the world, that's deeper hope. It's like the worse the situation, the greater hope can rise up. That's what he's saying. Hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism or happiness or something like that. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. So to me, I hear these two, I hear Joanna Macy and I hear Vaclav just announcing something here. Number one, reminding us, I think, of our deeper resources. And number two, saying the deepest well of human ingenuity, creativity, and curiosity can come from a hopeful place. And that human beings at their best act in the world, not on the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. And to come back to what I was saying at the beginning, kind of in the searching moral inventory, sort of examining what really matters right now, what really, really, really matters right now. And doing that kind of examination, and then beginning to act on the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out, I think is the age or the era or the collective invitation that we're being invited to. I think it's not just how do we survive this particular crisis, but what does this crisis reveal about how we're living collectively on this planet, how we're treating one another collectively on this planet. And if planetary consciousness is too much, which for most of us and most of the time that it is, how are we treating our own neighbors? How are we treating those close to home? How are we treating those on the other side of the political divide, which suddenly almost seems like meaningless right now? We have human beings who are suffering, human beings who are suffering, human beings who can't pay their bills, human beings who have lost their jobs, human beings who have been living under the illusion, which is no fault of their own, that the grocery store will always have unlimited supplies whenever I need it, and I can just go there and access it. And I can live paycheck to paycheck. We're all finding out just how thin that system is, and that we've been living under a kind of illusion, and it causes suffering in the world. And whenever there's suffering in the world, I think these two writers, Joanna Macy and Vaclav, are saying that's when hope is needed the most. And that's when we're being called upon to access some of those deeper resources, to be a certain way in the world. I think that's the challenge that I'm hearing. Oh man, so let me mention maybe just one thing in closing here. And it's kind of a thought that comes from Joanna Macy. So yesterday I went for a run, and ordinarily, if you maybe I've mentioned this to the C3 people, maybe not, but I like to do triathlons, and this is a time of year generally when my training is starting to ramp up, and I've been kind of on the fence about it anyway, like wondering what I'm going to do, and I've been kind of putting it off. But just a few weeks ago, I was like, all right, it's time to get back on it, and I started going to the Y and returning to at least some kind of training schedule. And as soon as this started, I just stopped, and started gaining weight and not running. And I started to feel it in my body the last few days, like a feeling of lethargy and anyway, so part of me knew from just past experience that I don't do well if I just sit around for too long. And I just need some physical exercise. I need a place for this energy to move. Even the angst and the insecurity and the anxiety, just to work it out in the body a little bit. So I went for a run. I was listening to Oasis, like the band from the 90s. I guess they're still a band, but I put on Oasis Essentials. And I'm just running, I'm just jogging, and it's very cold, which is one reason why I didn't want to go start exercising anyway. And I'm listening to this song, and all of a sudden, I think for the first time, I felt just a touch of grief about all this. And I mean, you might be thinking, well, that's kind of cold. Maybe you've already been feeling grief. I don't know. I've been more in like anxious, nervous, stress mode. And I felt that first wave of loss, like, yep, people are suffering, I'm suffering, people are suffering way more than me. And just a taste of my own privilege too, like, so I'm upset that I can't go to the Y, I actually have food in the pantry and in the freezer. I have resources. And anyway, I felt that first washing of just a little grief, a few tears about this whole situation. And I remembered something Joanna Macy said, that when we can touch both gratitude and grief, or being thankful and loss, when we can touch those two things, she says we start to see with new eyes. And maybe I just want to leave you with that, like maybe just a bit of gratitude. Like, I noticed that the mourning doves and the robins had returned this week, and also feeling and allowing yourself to feel a bit of the loss and the grief. So those two things, those two dynamics, have the capacity to help us see. Like the Jacob story, we lay down on a pillow and we wake up, and suddenly the world looks differently. And thus comes the invitation to act. So maybe those are the two things I want to leave you with. Hey, thank you, all 76 of you, for joining me. And I decided to do it on Instagram here too. I see people are waving at me. So I just thought I'd maybe just for 2 minutes look through and see if I see any questions here. Someone was mentioning that they're an Oasis fan. I saw them once live. It was great. So I'm just looking for any questions. Someone's just a comment here. I'm practicing ungluing from the news. Probably a good idea. Yeah. Here's Paul mentioning what's been called forth of my own patience, endurance, and compassion. He's feeling that calling: patience, endurance, and compassion. So these are mainly comments, which is great. I'm just going to scroll back and see if I see any questions. I don't right now, but in the future, as we continue to do this, I would like to encourage you to ask any questions that may be coming up during the course of the little talk here. So, friends, I wish you well today, and I wish you safety. I do, especially those of you who are feeling more strongly your own vulnerability and vulnerabilities, meaning the actual essence of what it means to be a human being, that everything is impermanent. I'm wishing you a sense of safety and well-being, and I wish you courage. And in light of today's talk, I hope you begin to feel your deeper resources that can coalesce around or constellate like the stars around something that we might call deep or active hope. And I hope that's true for you, for the community of C3, as we put one foot in front of the other in light of the difficult circumstances that we find ourselves in. So again, thank you for joining us. I see Mark from C3 put a link on here. If you want to make a donation, you could look in the comments. There's a link to help support C3 during this time. And so, yeah, I'm going to hop off here, and then I'm going to look for Patty's Facebook Live, and I'll repost it on the C3 site and on my personal site. I probably should just say, we need music, we need art, we need music, we need poetry, we need dance. Not just our rational faculties, but the full imaginative human expression of creativity. So check in with Patty, listen to what she's got to say. We need music right now more than ever, not just Oasis, but our local artists and musicians. So wishing you all peace and love and grace and well-being and hope.